Stop right there. This is not a child. The mother of 10 children was left in shock when the last one in her womb terrified the entire hospital. The sound of the scalpel echoed as the surgical lights shone down on Clara's sweat-drenched face. In the midst of agonizing pain, she was nearly exhausted. 9 babies had been delivered one after another, their faint cries resonating in the operating room. But when it came to the 10th, none of the doctors were sure it was actually a baby. Dr. Mendel, who had performed hundreds of difficult births, suddenly froze. His eyes widened, and his hands trembled as he stared at the ultrasound screen, still showing the image inside Clara's womb. His heart raced, and his throat went dry. Oh my God, what the hell is that? The entire operating room fell into an eerie silence. The nurses stopped all movement. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then a shrill scream pierced the quiet as the doctor slowly pulled the last object from Clara's abdomen. No crying, no signs of life. Instead of a newborn baby, the doctor held in his hands a grotesque, dark mass, firm and unnaturally hard as sight that no one in the room could believe. What exactly happened inside Clara's womb? Could this be a medical mistake, or was it an unprecedented mystery? Meanwhile, Robert, Clara's husband, was waiting outside, his hands shaking as he saw the doctor emerge with a pale face. His voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Robert, we need to talk immediately. Can you guess what happens next? Stay tuned until the very end to uncover this horrifying mystery. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next shocking story." Clara sat on the old wooden chair on the porch, her eyes following the rays of the evening sun as they filtered through the vast rice fields in front of her. The small village where she and her husband, Robert, lived had always been peaceful. The winding dirt roads, the small homes with red-tiled roofs, and the familiar neighbors greeting each other every day. It was the place where they grew up, fell in love, and dreamed of a happy home filled with the laughter of children. Robert stepped out from the house, holding a warm cup of tea, gently placing it into his wife's hands. He sat down beside her, his gaze tenderly fixed on the woman he had shared many years with. Clara smiled, but the smile held a hint of thoughtfulness. They had been married for 7 years, but up until now, their home had not known the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the yard. They had tried everything, from prayers in the small church at the end of the village to long trips to the city to visit doctors. Each time hope arose, each time they waited, only to be met with disappointment. Clara had cried many nights, afraid that she would never become a mother. But Robert had never lost faith. He always held her hand and whispered, "One day, we will have a child, my love, as long as we don't give up." They had prepared everything long ago. In their small house, there was an empty room, always waiting for a little angel to appear. Clara had carefully chosen a light blue paint color, believing it brought a sense of peace. On the wooden shelf by the window, she had placed a few small toys, gifts she had quietly bought every time she passed the children's store in town. These were the traces of a dream yet to be fulfilled. But today, the fresh air of the evening seemed to carry a different feeling. Clara gently touched her belly, a bright smile appearing on her face. She knew that their dream was about to come true. After all the years of waiting, she was finally carrying a little life within her. Robert took her hand, squeezed it gently, and together they silently gazed at the sunset ahead, where the bright red sun was slowly sinking behind the distant mountains. They had no idea that behind their happiness, a terrifying mystery was waiting for them just ahead. Clara woke up in the middle of the night, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. Just a few weeks ago, she couldn't even believe that she was truly pregnant. But now, her belly had grown so rapidly that it seemed almost impossible. Slowly, she sat up, feeling an unusual weight, different from what she had imagined pregnancy would feel like. Sometimes she would feel sharp pangs of pain, but she reassured herself that it was just a normal part of being pregnant. The next morning, as Clara looked into the mirror, she couldn't help but be startled. In such a short time, her belly had swollen to the point where it seemed to exceed the expected size for her pregnancy. She placed her hand on her smooth, taut skin, feeling as though there was something more inside her than just a baby. Robert noticed the change and began to grow concerned. "Maybe you should go to the hospital for a checkup, Clara. This doesn't seem like normal development." Clara nodded, a sense of unease filling her heart. A few days later, they visited the town hospital, where Dr. Mendel, an experienced obstetrician, performed an ultrasound on Clara. As the screen began to display the images from inside her body, Clara anxiously gripped Robert's hand. At first, Dr. Mendel smiled reassuringly, but within moments, his face turned serious. He remained silent, moving the ultrasound probe back and forth on Clara's belly multiple times, his eyes fixed on the screen. The air in the room began to feel tense. Clara looked at Robert, sensing the same tension in his eyes. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she asked, "Doctor, is my baby okay?" But Dr. Mendel didn't respond immediately. He stared at the screen for a few more seconds before turning to face the couple, his voice uncertain. "Clara, I don't know how to say this, but according to the ultrasound, you're not just carrying one baby, you're carrying 10. The room fell into a deathly silence. Robert held his breath, while Clara felt as though the world around her had shattered. She shook her head repeatedly, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. 10 babies? Can that even happen? Her voice faltered. Dr. Mendel nodded, his gaze still filled with disbelief. This is an extremely rare case. I've never seen anything like it in my entire career. Robert squeezed Clara's hand tightly, but even he couldn't fully accept this truth. 10 babies? How could they possibly take care of them all? But there was something else, something that Dr. Mendel hadn't immediately mentioned. In the ultrasound images, he had spotted a strange, dark mass nestled between the fetuses. It had no clear shape, nor did it show any signs of being a normal fetus. He stared at the image, a chilling sense of dread rising in his chest. But he decided not to say anything yet, as he himself couldn't fully understand what was happening. Clara sat on the bed, her trembling hand resting on her belly. She could feel the movements inside, but what unsettled her was how they occurred. Unlike the typical kicks that mothers often describe, sometimes she felt something tightening, twitching, even moving in a way she couldn't explain. The pain came more frequently now. At first, it was just a dull ache, a normal sign of pregnancy. But now, at times, the pain came suddenly and so sharply that it would make her pause in the middle of whatever she was doing. Once, while standing in the kitchen washing dishes, her stomach suddenly contracted hard, as though an invisible force was pushing from the inside. The plate in her hand slipped and shattered on the floor, causing Robert to rush over to her. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Robert caught Clara, his eyes full of worry. She clutched her stomach, her breathing quick, but she tried to reassure him. "It's just a contraction. Maybe the babies are kicking too hard." But deep down, Clara knew it wasn't a normal kick. Something wasn't right. Each day that passed, Clara's belly grew heavier than normal. She could hardly walk for long without feeling exhausted. Every night, when Robert was sound asleep, she lay in bed, her hand on her belly, listening to the movements inside. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she felt something slithering within her. It was no longer just the usual kicks. It was a long, crawling movement, as though something was wriggling around inside. She didn't dare tell Robert, fearing he would panic just as she had. But Robert wasn't blind to these changes. He watched Clara every day, noticing how she tried to hide her growing anxiety. There were nights when he woke up to find her sitting there, staring at her unusually swollen belly. "Clara, you need to tell me if something's wrong," he said gently but firmly. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I don't know, Robert. I feel like something isn't right. I'm not sure if this is what a mother carrying 10 babies is supposed to go through. I feel like there's something else inside me." Her words sent a chill down Robert's spine. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt the same unease. Ever since Dr. Mendel had told them about the 10 babies, a part of him had a sinking feeling. No one in medical history had carried this many babies without complications. But there was something that troubled him even more. The strange dark mass Dr. Mendel had seen in the previous ultrasound results. Clara grew weaker and weaker. The pains weren't just ordinary contractions anymore. Sometimes it felt like something was scraping from the inside. She couldn't bear it any longer and decided to return to the hospital for another checkup. This time, as soon as the doctor placed the ultrasound probe on her belly, he froze. His eyes widened, and his hands trembled slightly. Once again, the strange dark mass appeared on the screen. But this time, it was larger, clearer, and most terrifying of all, it seemed to be moving. Clara looked at the doctor, her voice small but filled with fear. "Doctor, what's going on?" Mendel remained silent for a few seconds, then slowly placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, his voice lowered, hesitant. "We need to run some more tests immediately." Robert gripped his wife's hand tightly, feeling as though something terrible was about to happen. They had no idea that what was about to be discovered would change their lives forever. Clara lay on the examination bed, the coldness of the ultrasound gel spreading across her belly, making her shiver slightly. Dr. Mindel held the ultrasound probe, moving it slowly across her stomach, his eyes intensely focused on the screen in front of him. At first, his face remained calm, but within moments, his expression shifted. His eyes widened, and his hand tightened around the device more than usual. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy. Robert noticed the change immediately. He glanced at the doctor, then at his wife, feeling a cold chill run down his spine. "Is something wrong, doctor?" His voice was no longer steady. But Dr. Mindel didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to move the probe, checking from several different angles. The nurses standing nearby exchanged puzzled looks, some even quietly stepping back as though they were witnessing something unusual. Clara felt her throat dry up. She couldn't see the screen, but from the reactions around her, she knew something was wrong. "Doctor, please tell me what's happening." Her voice was small but trembled with fear. Finally, Dr. Mindel set the device down, turning to face the couple with an expression of disbelief. "I'm not sure what I'm seeing, but there's a very clear anomaly." Robert furrowed his brow. "Anomaly? What do you mean? Doctor, please explain." Dr. Mindel glanced at the screen once more before taking a deep breath, trying to keep his voice as calm as possible. "There's something inside her that I've never seen before." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Clara felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Robert gripped her hand tightly as Dr. Mindel continued to explain. "I've done thousands of ultrasounds in my career, but I've never seen anything like this. It doesn't look like a fetus. It doesn't look like any tumor I've encountered either. It has an unclear shape, and its size changes depending on the angle." Mindel paused for a moment, his gaze flicking over Clara and Robert's panic-stricken faces, before continuing. "And what worries me the most is that it is moving in a way I can't explain." His words cut through Clara like a cold blade. She felt as though her whole body had frozen. The strange pains, the sensations of something slithering inside her, could they be connected to what the doctor had just mentioned? Robert shot up from his seat, his hands bracing against the edge of the examination table. "What do you mean? What is it?" he demanded. Dr. Mindel shook his head. "We need to run more tests, but right now, I can't say for certain what this is. All we know is that this is not a normal pregnancy." At that moment, Clara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her vision blurring for a moment. Robert rushed to support her, but in his mind, one question echoed relentlessly: what is growing inside his wife? The news of Clara's pregnancy quickly spread throughout the town. A woman pregnant with 10 babies was already shocking enough, but the rumors about the anomaly and the ultrasound results sent whispers through every corner of the village. People talked about it everywhere, from small coffee shops to the marketplace. Some believed it was a miracle, while others suspected something was terribly wrong. Some of the older villagers even whispered that perhaps it was an omen of something bad. But among all the gossip, only Clara and Robert knew that the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Because right now, Clara could feel something shifting inside her, and it didn't feel like a normal baby. Clara woke up in the middle of the night, sweat pouring down her forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. Her stomach tightened violently, the pain spreading throughout her body as though something inside her was trying to force its way out. She clenched her teeth, gripping the sheets tightly in an attempt to stifle her cries, but the agony was overwhelming. Robert immediately woke up, sensing something was wrong. He quickly turned on the light, panic filling his face as he saw his wife curled up, her pale face twisted in fear. "Clara, what's wrong?" Robert asked urgently, but she just shook her head, struggling to breathe through the pain. This time, the pain was different from anything she had experienced during the pregnancy. It wasn't just a normal contraction. It felt like something was trying to escape from inside her. Robert panicked, lifting her into his arms. "We need to get to the hospital now." There was no time to think or reassure each other. He almost carried Clara out of the bed and into the car. On the way there, Clara gripped her stomach tightly, her breath shallow. Every time a wave of pain hit, it felt like a tidal wave building inside her. She wanted to believe this was just a normal part of pregnancy, but deep inside, a growing fear was taking over her mind. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Mindel was already waiting, his face grim. He immediately ushered Clara into the ultrasound room, this time with more advanced equipment to get a closer look at the condition of the pregnancy. As the screen flickered to life, Dr. Mindel moved the probe over Clara's belly, observing each image that appeared. But then, his face went pale. Robert noticed the change in the doctor's demeanor immediately. He stood close to Clara, his voice filled with worry. "Doctor, is my wife okay?" Mindel didn't answer right away. He adjusted the angle of the probe, zooming in on a specific area of the screen. The images before him rendered the room so silent that Robert could almost hear his own heartbeat. Clara, despite enduring the excruciating pain, could sense the heavy tension filling the room. She swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Doctor, what's going on?" Mendel turned back to face them, his voice heavy. "I need you to undergo more tests immediately." Robert squeezed Clara's hand, the feeling of an approaching storm overwhelming him. But what terrified him even more was Mendel's expression. It wasn't just the concern of a doctor facing a difficult delivery. It was the fear of having seen something he couldn't explain. Clara could feel it too, a growing certainty that something was developing inside her, and it wasn't just a child. In the days that followed, Clara struggled to rise from the bed, but as soon as she moved, a violent cramp hit her, causing her to collapse right where she stood. Her hand gripped the bed frame, her breath coming in sharp gasps as though someone was choking her. This pain was unlike any she had experienced before. It didn't concentrate in one spot, but spread across her entire abdomen, as if invisible hands were tightening within her. Clara tried to steady her breathing, but with each surge of pain, it felt like something was tearing her apart from the inside. Robert rushed to her side, his eyes filled with panic. He had never seen Clara in this much pain. "Clara, are you okay?" But instead of answering, she could only weakly moan, tears streaming down her cheeks. She felt as if she was about to pass out. A wave of dizziness hit her, vision blurred, and her entire body went cold. Without hesitation, Robert scooped Clara up and rushed out the door. The night outside was dark and heavy, the air thick with a sense of impending dread. The car sped along the empty road, the streetlights casting faint, trembling beams of light. Robert kept glancing at Clara in the rearview mirror, his heart breaking as he saw her clutching her stomach, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Hang in there. We're almost there," he spoke, trying to reassure himself more than her. But deep down, he had no idea what was waiting for them at the hospital. At the hospital, Dr. Mendel had been notified in advance and was ready to receive them. Seeing Clara being rushed in, he immediately ordered the nurses to prepare the delivery room. "She can't wait any longer. We need to do an immediate check." The nurses hurried off, the sound of the bed wheels echoing coldly through the hospital hallway. Dr. Mendel bent over Clara, his face showing deep concern. "Clara, I know you're in pain, but I need you to stay calm. We'll do everything we can to ensure the safety of you and the babies." But Clara could barely hear him anymore. His voice seemed distant, as if she were sinking into another space altogether. Suddenly, her stomach contracted violently, and her body arched as though some invisible force was pulling her from the inside. A nurse screamed in panic as the updated ultrasound image appeared on the screen. Dr. Mendel looked at it, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuine fear. He turned to another doctor, his voice strained with tension. "We need to move her to the operating room immediately." Robert gripped Clara's hand, feeling how cold her skin had become. He had never felt more helpless than in that moment. "Everything will be fine, darling. I'm here. I'm not leaving you." But deep inside, he knew that something was happening, something that was entirely beyond human control. Dr. Mendel held the ultrasound probe, moving it slowly across Clara's stomach. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the steady beep of the machines. He furrowed his brow, his eyes fixed on the screen as if trying to confirm something. The tension in the room was palpable. Robert gripped his wife's hand, feeling her cold fingers tremble in his. Then, suddenly, Dr. Mendel stopped. His entire body went rigid, his hand gripping the probe tighter than before. For several seconds, he remained silent, staring at the screen, his eyes reflecting an overwhelming confusion. A nurse approached, about to ask something, but as soon as she saw the screen, her mouth fell open in shock, and she instinctively stepped back. "This can't be," Dr. Mendel whispered, almost to himself. Robert furrowed his brow, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Clara, seeing her holding her breath, her face pale with fear. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Robert spoke up, his voice dry and hoarse. "Doctor, what's happening? Is there something wrong with my baby?" Mendel slowly turned toward them. His expression was so serious that Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. He swallowed hard, as if struggling to find the right words. Then, in a low, measured tone, he uttered a sentence that seemed to freeze the air in the room. "Something is wrong. One of them is not a baby." Those words cut through the atmosphere like a knife, leaving Clara and Robert in stunned silence. Clara felt her chest tighten, her mind spinning. She didn't understand, or more accurately, she didn't want to understand what the doctor had just said. She looked at Robert, hoping for some kind of reaction from him, but he sat there, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes filled with just as much confusion and fear. It can't be. Clara shook her head, her voice weak. What do you mean? If it's not a baby, then what is it? Mendel didn't answer right away. He turned back to the screen, his finger pointing to a dark, unclear area in the ultrasound image. I can't be sure, but it doesn't have the structure of a normal fetus. There's no heartbeat, no movement like the other embryos. But it's still growing. A chill swept through Clara. She gripped Robert's hand tighter, trying to find some sense of safety in the midst of the chaos. Robert swallowed, his voice shaking as he tried to remain composed. Is it some kind of birth defect? Or a tumor? Mendel shook his head, his eyes filled with a rare confusion. I've never seen anything like this before. It doesn't behave like a tumor, but it also doesn't show signs of life like a normal fetus. And what worries me most is that it is changing shape. Clara felt a wave of dizziness hit her, her breath coming in short gasps. She wanted to believe the doctor had made a mistake, that this was just a misread ultrasound, that there was nothing wrong. But the pain, the strange sensations inside her, everything was telling her otherwise. Robert gripped his wife's shoulder, trying to steady his voice despite his own trembling. So, what do we do now, doctor? Is it dangerous? Mendel sighed, his gaze full of concern. I can't say for certain right now, but I want her to stay in the hospital for close monitoring. We can't take any chances with such an unusual pregnancy. Clara looked at Robert, tears starting to fall down her cheeks. She had never felt so terrified in her life. She just wanted a normal pregnancy, a small, peaceful family like everyone else. But now, inside her, alongside the 9 growing babies, there was something else, something that no one could explain. Could this be a previously undetected medical defect, or was it something entirely not of this world? Robert held Clara tightly, as if releasing her might send them both falling into an abyss of the unknown. And though no one spoke the words, both of them knew that from this moment on, their lives would never be the same again. The sound of the hospital bed wheels racing down the long corridor mixed with Clara's screams as the intense pain gripped her stomach. Sweat poured down her forehead, and her eyes were wide with fear. Robert ran close beside her, gripping her hand tightly, but even he could feel the fear tightening around him. He was not only worried about Clara's contractions, but also haunted by what Dr. Mendel had said earlier. One of them is not a baby. The meaning of those words echoed in Robert's mind the entire way from home to the hospital. If it wasn't a baby, then what was it? Could it be an unrecognized birth defect, or something worse, something that science could not explain? He tried to shake the dark thoughts from his mind, but looking at Clara writhing in pain, he knew they could no longer pretend everything was normal. Dr. Mendel was waiting in the emergency room, his face tight with unprecedented tension. He no longer seemed calm, and as soon as he saw Clara, he immediately ordered, "Get her into the operating room now. We can't wait another second." Things moved too fast for Clara to understand where she even was anymore. She only heard the chaotic sounds, the doctor shouting commands, the nurses preparing instruments, the sound of the bed wheels grinding over the cold-tiled floor. Clara felt an oxygen mask placed over her face, and her breathing slowly became easier, but the pain still tore through her as if it were ripping her body apart. Robert was stopped at the operating room door. A nurse held him back, shaking her head. "You can't go in. We'll do everything we can to save both the mother and the babies." He stood there, his heart in his throat, watching Clara being pushed into the room. The door slammed shut in front of him, leaving him alone with the gnawing fear eating at his mind. Inside the operating room, Dr. Mendel donned his gloves, his eyes sharp with determination. "Let's begin immediately. The mother's heart rate is dropping. We don't have much time." A scalpel made a small incision on Clara's skin, layers of tissue separating under the bright surgical lights. Clara's heart rate on the monitor remained stable, but the doctors knew she was growing weaker. The first cry rang out. Everyone exhaled in relief. The first baby had arrived safely. A nurse quickly carried the baby to the NICU. Then came the second, the third. One by one, the babies were brought out of Clara's womb, each cry ringing like a beacon of light in the storm of worry. Robert stood outside, trying to listen. He held his breath, counting each cry. 1, 2, 3, 6, 9. Then there was silence. Inside the operating room, an eerie quiet took over. The doctors stopped, all staring at Clara. She lay motionless on the table, her face pale from blood loss, her breath shallow. But Dr. Mendel wasn't focused on that right now. He was staring at Clara's still open abdomen, where the 10th child was supposed to be. But it wasn't like the others. Dr. Mendel slowly reached in, but as soon as he touched what was inside, he immediately jerked his hand back. A chill ran down his spine. What the hell is this? A nurse stepped closer, but as soon as she saw, she instinctively recoiled. Her face turned white as paper. Clara, still drifting in a drugged haze, felt the disturbance. She turned her head toward the doctor, her voice weak but filled with fear. "Doctor, what's going on? Where's my baby?" But no one answered, because what Dr. Mendel had just pulled from her womb was not a baby. It wasn't soft. It didn't have the pink, smooth skin of a normal child. It was cold, rigid, and covered in a strange black hue that enveloped its entire form. There was no cry, no signs of life. The entire operating room was engulfed in absolute terror. A young doctor standing nearby stammered, his voice trembling. "Doctor, what is this?" Dr. Mendel stood frozen, his hand still gripping the object that had just been pulled from Clara's womb. Around him, no one dared to breathe. The operating room immersed in an eerie silence. What they were looking at was not a baby. It was an abnormal growth, so unbelievable that it defied all logic. The mass was a deep black, its surface rough and covered in a thick, scaly membrane. But the most bizarre thing wasn't its shape. It was that it was moving. A nurse stepped back, her hand covering her mouth as though she was about to vomit. "Doctor, it just contracted, didn't it?" Mendel didn't respond immediately. He gritted his teeth, trying to stay composed. Clearly, this was unlike any tumor he had ever seen. It wasn't rigid like typical tumors. It had an unusual flexibility. When he brought a tool closer to inspect it, it contracted slightly, almost as if it could sense the contact. Another doctor spoke up, his voice dry with terror. How could something like this have developed inside her? Clara, though exhausted and still under the effects of the anesthesia, could feel the panic swirling around her. She weakly turned her head, her eyes barely opening as she gazed toward Dr. Mendel. "Doctor, where's my baby?" No one answered. Dr. Mendel swallowed, trying to find the right words to explain. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you." He paused, his expression darkening. "The 10th baby. It never existed." His words echoed through the room, striking Clara's mind like a sharp blade. She felt as if the entire world was crashing down around her. "It can't be," she gasped. I felt it. I saw it on the ultrasound. It was real." Dr. Mendel nodded, his voice deepening with confusion. "We saw it too. But it's not a fetus. It's a form of mutated tumor, something never recorded in medical science." The other doctors began murmuring among themselves. One of them, a specialist in oncology, moved closer to examine the mass. But how could a tumor be this size? And more importantly, how could it be moving? A nurse recoiled, her body trembling. It's not some kind of creature, is it?" Mendel clenched his jaw, his eyes locked onto the grotesque form in front of him. "We can't draw any conclusions right now, but clearly, this is not a normal tumor." Robert stood outside the operating room, nearly driven mad with worry as he hadn't heard any news. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, the door swung open, and a young doctor stepped out, his face pale. "Robert, you need to come in here right now." He rushed into the room without thinking, and the moment his eyes fell upon what Dr. Mendel was holding, his entire world seemed to shatter. "My God, what is that?" Clara looked at Robert, tears streaming down her face. "Tell me, where's our baby?" Robert couldn't answer, because at that very moment, in front of them, the mass twitched again, almost as if it were still alive. Clara felt as if the entire world was crumbling before her eyes. She lay on the operating table, her body limp, her breath shallow, but the only thing she could think of in that moment was, "Where is my 10th child?" She looked over at Robert, hoping he could offer some explanation, some glimmer of light to pull her from this nightmare. But Robert stood there, silent, his eyes fixed on the grotesque mass that Dr. Mendel was holding. He couldn't say a word. He too didn't understand what was happening. How could this be happening? They had been eagerly awaiting the moment to welcome 10 children for months. They had imagined how many cribs they would need, how they would divide the responsibilities of childcare, how they would endure sleepless nights. But now, all those plans had been shattered by one terrifying truth. The 10th child had never existed. Clara shook her head, tears flowing uncontrollably. "No, this can't be true. It can't be." She tried to sit up, but the pain was so intense she couldn't lift her arms. She turned to Dr. Mendel, almost shouting, Doctor, tell me this is a mistake. The baby must still be somewhere, right? Mendel lowered his head, his voice dropping, filled with helplessness. Clara, I wish I could tell you this is just an error. But the truth is, there is no 10th baby. What we removed from your womb is not a fetus. Robert clenched his fists, his mind spinning. He had never faced such a horrifying truth. He had always believed in what was real, in things that could be explained scientifically. But now, he was standing before something without a logical explanation. But how could this happen? Robert's voice cracked, his eyes red with despair. The ultrasound showed 10 babies. We saw it. We felt it. Mendel sighed, his eyes still locked on the deformed mass that he couldn't look away from. We saw it too. But it seems that from the beginning, it was never really a baby. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She shook her head frantically, muttering, No, 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 this can't be. Memories flooded back. Those times she felt strange movements in her belly, the unusual contractions she had tried to ignore, the hesitation in Dr. Mendel's voice during every ultrasound. All the signs were there, but she didn't want to believe it. She turned to Robert, gripping his hand, her eyes filled with hopelessness. Then what is it, Robert? If it's not our child, what is it? Robert couldn't answer. No one in the room could answer. Outside the operating room, hurried footsteps echoed as other doctors rushed in after hearing about the bizarre surgery. But at that moment, for Clara and Robert, there was only one brutal, painful truth. They had been ready to welcome 10 children, but now only 9 healthy babies remained, and something terrifying had replaced their 10th child. And the most frightening thing was, no one knew exactly what that something was. The sound of the wheels rolling across the hospital floor echoed in the tense silence. The strange mass that Dr. Mendel had just removed from Clara's abdomen was carefully placed into a sterile container and swiftly transferred to the laboratory. No one in the operating room dared to touch it for too long. The doctors carried with them an unspoken fear, an unease unlike anything they had ever felt when looking at something that no one could name. In the research room, a team of top experts was hastily summoned to examine the specimen. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a leading pathologist, carefully opened the container and observed the mass under the bright lights of the lab. The first thing that sent a chill down her spine was that the mass was still moving slightly, even after being removed from Clara's body. What the hell is this? Dr. Lawrence, an oncologist, furrowed his brow and moved closer to examine it. A tumor shouldn't react like this after being removed. It's still functioning in some way. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She put on gloves and used a small scalpel to cut a tiny piece of the mass to place under the microscope. As the image was magnified on the screen, the entire research team went still. It's cells, Sarah muttered, her eyes wide in disbelief. This isn't like any cell I've ever studied. Under the microscope, instead of the typical structure of a tumor, the mass had cells that looked almost organic but not entirely human. The cells didn't form any recognizable pattern. They changed shape continuously, as if they were trying to adapt to their new environment. Dr. Lawrence furrowed his brow and took a step back. Are you sure this is a tumor? Because I've never seen a type of cell that can mutate like this. Sarah shook her head, her voice shaking. I'm not sure anymore. But this doesn't exist in any medical texts I know. The group fell silent for a few seconds. Then another researcher timidly spoke up. Is there any chance that this is not entirely human? The question made the atmosphere in the lab even more suffocating. No one wanted to admit that they were facing something that could not be explained by conventional science. Outside the laboratory, Dr. Mendel stood with his back against the wall, his hands clasped together in worry. He had been an obstetrician for over 30 years, witnessing countless difficult births, but never in his life had he felt this powerless. He couldn't tell Clara that everything would be fine, because the truth was, no one knew what was really happening. Robert walked over, his gaze filled with desperation. Doctor, tell me what's going on. What is it? Mendel took a deep breath, meeting Robert's eyes, but all he could see in them was confusion. I wish I could answer that question, Robert, but right now, we don't know either. In the cold, sterile lab, the fluorescent white light reflected off the tense faces of the doctors. The mass that had been removed from Clara's body lay still on the examination table, but no one dared to relax even for a second. It was not just a simple mass of dead tissue like any other tumor. There was something different about it, something no one dared to name but everyone could feel. As Dr. Sarah Whitmore leaned in, her eyes widened as she observed the cells under the microscope. The tissue sample was unstable. The cells of the mass constantly changed shape as if they were reacting to the surrounding environment. At times, they looked like skin cells, but within seconds, their structure shifted to something resembling nerve cells. Then, suddenly, they morphed into a completely unidentifiable tissue form. Sarah swallowed, her hand gripping the edge of the table. No medical record had ever documented the existence of this type of cell. Not only was it capable of self-regeneration, but it seemed to possess some kind of awareness, an inexplicable defensive reaction. Dr. Lawrence, standing beside her, couldn't hide his confusion. He flipped through a few pages of notes before staring at the genetic data of the mass displayed on the screen. Based on the analysis, this mass contains part of Clara's DNA, he said slowly, his voice dropping in astonishment. But the rest doesn't match any genetic code in our database. The room fell into a deathly silence. The doctors exchanged worried glances. One of them cleared his throat, trying to break the oppressive atmosphere. What do you mean? Is this some rare genetic mutation? Sarah shook her head, her expression darkening. If it were just a mutation, it would still follow some biological rule. But this doesn't. She stared at the image under the microscope, where one of the cells had just divided in an abnormal way. It wasn't just growing. It was creating an entirely new form of tissue, a structure that resembled an embryo. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized what she was seeing. She stood up suddenly, feeling suffocated, unable to breathe. In Clara's hospital room, she still hadn't slept, even with the sedatives running through her veins. She could still feel that something was wrong. An unfamiliar sensation crept into her mind, as if a part of her body was still connected to what had been removed. She placed her hand on her belly, where 10 children had been growing day by day, but now there were only 9 healthy babies. She couldn't explain why she felt so empty. Robert sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, she would be sucked into an endless abyss. He knew she was still haunted by what had just happened. "Do you feel any better?" he whispered softly. Clara turned toward him, her eyes empty yet filled with confusion. "Do you think it's still here?" Robert furrowed his brow, feeling a chill at her words. "What do you mean?" Clara swallowed hard, her breath shaky. "I don't know, but I can still feel it. Not with my hands, not with my eyes, but somehow, in my mind." In the laboratory, Sarah nearly jumped out of her seat when she saw what happened next on the screen. The mass's cells underwent another unusual movement, and an embryonic tissue formed in an inexplicable way. It didn't resemble anything recorded in scientific history. She turned quickly, grabbed the phone, and dialed Dr. Mendel's number urgently. She had to inform him immediately. If what she was seeing was real, then this thing hadn't fully died yet. And worse, it was still trying to grow. In Clara's room, she suddenly opened her eyes, her breath coming in rapid gasps, as though she had just awoken from a nightmare. Robert jumped, quickly reaching for her shoulder. "Clara, what's wrong?" But Clara couldn't speak. Her body trembled, her eyes filled with terror. It's still here," she stammered, clutching the bedsheet tightly. Robert looked around the room, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Clara gasped for air, holding her stomach with both hands, her voice almost breaking. "It's still here, and I can feel it." At that moment, in the lab, Sarah dropped the phone when she saw the last image before the screen suddenly went dark. Under the microscope, the tissue sample contracted, then suddenly, it split apart and began multiplying at an alarming rate. Sarah stepped back, feeling as though a nightmare was turning into reality. If what she was witnessing was true, then this wasn't just a tumor anymore. It was trying to survive. It was still alive. And worst of all, it hadn't left. It was still trying to return to Clara. The hospital room was suffocating with tension. Clara lay on the bed, her face pale, sweat pouring down her forehead as her body trembled as if she were running a high fever. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't a typical fever. Robert stood by her bedside, holding her hand tightly, but the panic in his eyes was impossible to hide. He had been through everything imaginable during Clara's pregnancy, but this moment, it was unlike anything he had ever anticipated. Dr. Mendel stood frozen for a few seconds, his eyes locked on Clara's abdomen. It was no longer flat as it had been before. Just above the incision, beneath Clara's pale skin, a distinct movement appeared. At first, it was just a slight ripple, like a normal contraction of the body recovering. But then, the movement grew stronger. It had its own rhythm, as though something inside Clara was still alive, something that hadn't been fully removed. A nurse stepped back, her face white as a sheet, her breath quickened as if she had just witnessed something impossible to explain. It's moving," she whispered, her voice trembling. Clara felt her whole body freeze, but at the same time, the pain inside her grew more intense. She couldn't see the movement, but she could feel it. Something was still inside her, something that should have been removed during the surgery. Robert squeezed Clara's hand, his voice hoarse. Doctor, what's happening to her? Mendel didn't respond immediately. He kept staring at Clara's abdomen, then suddenly turned around, his voice more urgent than ever. We need to get her into the operating room right now. If not, I fear. He stopped short, unwilling to finish the sentence. Nurses rushed to Clara's side, pushing the bed out of the room as fast as they could. Clara tried to say something, but the pain was too much for her to speak. Robert followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with unspoken questions. He didn't understand what was happening, but deep inside, an overwhelming fear was rising. If the 10th baby had never existed, then why did Clara still feel it? And the most terrifying thing, if it hadn't truly disappeared, then what was it? Meanwhile, inside the laboratory, Dr. Sarah Whitmore couldn't take her eyes off the microscope screen. Her breath quickened as she realized something she hadn't dared think about before. The cells of the mass, which they had believed had been removed from Clara's body, were still dividing. But this time, they weren't just shifting aimlessly as before. They were forming a more defined structure, something organized. The cells were aligning into chains, creating connections resembling nerve tissue. And the worst part, on the screen, amidst the complex pathways, a tiny pulse appeared. It wasn't a heartbeat of a human, but it had life. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide in terror. This was no longer just a tumor. It wasn't simply a birth defect or an unusual biological phenomenon. It was an entity trying to survive. And the thought that terrified her the most was the one that flashed through her mind. It might be trying to find its way back into Clara's body. Just at that moment, her phone rang. She grabbed it, seeing the caller's name. It was Dr. Mendel. She answered immediately, but before he could speak, Sarah blurted out, "Doctor, it's not dead. It's still growing." On the other end of the line, Mendel was silent for a few seconds. He glanced at Clara writhing in agony on the bed as they rushed her into the operating room, feeling as if this nightmare would never end. His voice became even more urgent. "Sarah, we need to know right now. What exactly is it?" Sarah bit her lip, her hand tightening around the phone, with only one answer running through her mind, a truth she didn't want to believe. "I don't know, but it's not ours." Back in the operating room, Clara suddenly opened her eyes, her breath coming in rapid gasps as if she had just awoken from a nightmare. Robert jumped, quickly reaching for her shoulder. "Clara, what's wrong?" But Clara couldn't speak. Her body trembled, her eyes filled with terror. It's still here," she stammered, clutching the bed sheet tightly. Robert looked around the room, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Clara gasped for air, holding her stomach with both hands, her voice almost breaking. "It's still here, and I can feel it." At that moment, in the lab, Sarah dropped the phone when she saw the last image before the screen suddenly went dark. Under the microscope, the tissue sample contracted, then suddenly, it split apart and began multiplying at an alarming rate. Sarah stepped back, feeling as though a nightmare was turning into reality. If what she was witnessing was true, then this wasn't just a tumor anymore. It was trying to survive. It was still alive. And worst of all, it hadn't left. It was still trying to return to Clara. The room was plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and went out. The relentless blaring of warning alarms filled the air, and the faint light from medical equipment screens flickered, casting erratic, ghostly shadows over the terrified faces of the people present. Robert took a step back, his heart racing in his chest as he stared at Clara, or what had become Clara. Her hand still gripped the edge of the bed, but her body was no longer trembling from pain. Instead, it was unnaturally stiff. Dr. Mendel stood frozen, his gaze fixed on Clara. She still lay there, but her eyes had completely changed. They no longer held any human essence. They were hollow, deep, endless black, as if they didn't belong to this world. Even the way she breathed was abnormal, each inhalation as if absorbing more than oxygen, and each exhalation accompanied by a strange, soft but haunting sound. Robert felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had always vowed to protect his wife, but now the woman lying in front of him was no longer Clara. Sarah stood motionless, her eyes glued to the tear in Clara's abdomen, where a slimy, hand-like appendage had appeared. It was still there, but it wasn't emerging further. It was convulsing as if it were assessing its surroundings. She wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, that her brain was playing tricks on her, but everything before her was too real. The dark fluid continued to seep from the wound, dripping onto the white hospital sheets, creating streaks that looked like veins spreading across the fabric. One of the nurses choked on a sob and turned to the door, trying to open it, but it remained locked, as though some unseen force was holding it shut. Clara blinked slowly, then cracked a twisted smile. She tilted her head, her cold eyes scanning everyone in the room before they settled on Robert. "Darling, why do you look so scared?" Her voice rang out, but it was no longer the voice he recognized. It was deeper, distorted, as if multiple voices were layered over each other. Robert felt his legs go weak, his body screaming to run away, but he couldn't. He couldn't leave her. Mindel clenched his hands, trying to remain calm. "We need to stop this immediately," he said, turning to another doctor. "Prepare a high dose of sedatives. We don't know what's happening, but we can't let this continue." A nurse shakily grabbed the syringe, but before she could approach Clara, a strange, cold air filled the room, freezing everyone in place. The hand-like appendage suddenly twitched violently, then retracted back into Clara's body with a sharp hiss. The entire room seemed to lose sound for a few seconds before a violent contraction ripped through Clara's body. She arched up, her body jerking uncontrollably, causing the bed to shake violently. The overhead lights flickered wildly, casting erratic reflections on her skin, making it look almost translucent. Then, everything stopped. Clara collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air, her eyes squeezed shut. Dr. Mindel gestured for the nurse to move closer, but the moment they took a step toward the bed, Clara opened her eyes, and this time, no one could keep their composure. Her dark eyes suddenly turned a brilliant red, no trace of humanity left within them. A soft laugh echoed through the room, small but full of dread. Clara slowly sat up, her hand placed over her stomach, gently caressing the scar as if feeling something inside. "Doctor," she spoke, her voice now carrying an unnatural resonance. "You can't get rid of it. It's a part of me." Robert could no longer bear it. He shook his head, backing away, his voice breaking. "Clara, this isn't you. You have to fight it. You have to break free from this." But Clara only tilted her head, as if considering his words. Sarah felt paralyzed. She looked from Mindel to Robert, then back to Clara, her mind overwhelmed with a single question. Had they truly lost Clara, or was what sat before them now simply the shell of something that had fully taken over her body? She wanted to believe there was still a chance, but when Clara's blood-red eyes slowly scanned each person in the room, Sarah knew that everything had gone too far. Clara smiled once more, then spoke in a voice entirely foreign to her. "Don't worry," she said, then turned her head to look directly at Robert. "You'll understand soon." And right after that, the operating room door swung open as if some invisible force had freed it. A cold gust of wind poured into the room, causing the curtains to flutter and medical papers to scatter across the floor. But no one dared to move. No one knew what would happen next, because the worst part had yet to begin. Clara slowly placed one foot on the ground, then the other, stepping off the bed with a slow but purposeful gait. She was no longer a patient who had just undergone surgery, no longer a mother exhausted after giving birth. She was now something else, and the worst part was, no one knew what it might do next. The hospital room was devoid of sound, save for the oppressive silence that hung over everything. Clara stood there amidst the frozen doctors and nurses, paralyzed by fear, her red eyes gleaming with something inhuman. She tilted her head, slowly reaching down to touch her stomach where it still existed, still pulsing with mysterious beats, as if she and it had become one. No one dared move. No one knew what to do. Robert took a step back, his eyes wide with panic. He couldn't believe that the woman in front of him was the wife he had loved, the one who had been writhing in pain just hours earlier in the operating room. He wanted to believe that she was still there, trapped inside this body. But the more he looked into her vacant gaze and saw the twisted smile on her face, the more he realized that Clara, the woman he knew, was no longer here. Dr. Mindel felt an icy chill run through his body. This was no longer a medical field he could explain. They had made a mistake from the very beginning. They thought they could remove what was inside Clara, assuming it was just a tumor, an abnormality. But no, it had never been a tumor. It was a living entity, something that had found a way to grow, hide, and now, it had completely taken control of Clara's body. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. A strange, cold breeze filled the space, dimming the remaining flickering lights. Papers and medical records fluttered across the floor as the machines flickered lifelessly. Clara let out a quiet laugh, then turned away, her slow footsteps echoing in the room as she walked toward the door. Everyone could only stand frozen, unable to stop her. She walked as if she knew exactly where she was going, as though a different purpose was awaiting her ahead. Robert wanted to run after her, to stop her, but his legs wouldn't move. A part of him wanted to save his wife, but another part, deep within his soul, whispered that the thing standing before him was no longer Clara. The hospital door swung wide open, and the wind howled down the long, empty hallway. Clara walked forward, her small frame now carrying an invisible force that no one understood. She was no longer a patient. She was something else. And the most terrifying thing was, she wasn't walking alone. Far in the distance, in the thick darkness, something was waiting. Clara was no longer Clara. But where was she going? And what would happen next? Stay tuned for part 2 to uncover this terrifying mystery. If you want to know the horrifying truth waiting ahead, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell now. This is just the beginning of the nightmare.